The dogs were meant to kill. That is exactly what they were taught to do. They were starved, hit, and trained to tear meat from bone without waiting. On a muggy August night in 1847, at a far-off farm in the deep woods of northern Georgia, a boss named Garrett Thorne gave an order that would be talked about in the county for many years. He ordered 4 enslaved people, who were accused of trying to run away, to be thrown into the pens where the hunting dogs were kept. The farm owner was away on work in Savannah, leaving Thorne in total control. What happened inside those pens went against what everyone thought would happen. By the morning, the dogs had not attacked. Instead, they had done something that left even the toughest people watching without words. The farm's papers were hidden away, the boss disappeared within weeks, and the 4 enslaved people were never seen again. For more than 100 years, the truth stayed hidden in whispered rumors and broken letters. But the whole story, put together from lost journals, county records, and stories recorded many years later, shows a night that challenged everything the people of that time thought about loyalty, cruelty, and the limits of human kindness. Before we go on with the story of Garrett Thorne and the Hargrove Farm, take a second to subscribe to this channel and press the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one, and let us know in the comments what state or city you are listening from. Now, let's find out what really happened that night. The Hargrove Farm covered nearly 800 acres of thick Georgia pine forest and red clay fields, separated from the nearest town by a full day's ride on a horse. It was a place where the outside world felt far away, almost unimportant. The main house, a 2-story building with white posts and wide porches, stood in the middle of the land, surrounded by lines of slave cabins, tobacco barns, and storage sheds. Past the planted fields lay thick woods where wild pigs walked, and the air hung heavy with the smell of pine sap and wet dirt. The farm was owned by Samuel Hargrove, a man in his late 50s, who had got the land from his father and made it bigger through smart money moves and hard efficiency. Hargrove was known all over the area as a strict but smart businessman. He hardly ever raised his voice, but his choices were final. He spent a lot of his time traveling to Savannah and Charleston, making deals for tobacco contracts, and going to parties with other rich landowners. In his absence, the daily work fell to Garrett Thorne. Thorne was a different kind of man altogether. Lean and sun, burned with a face that seemed always set in a frown, he had worked his way up from a field worker on a nearby farm to the job of overseer through pure meanness and a strong belief in his own power. He carried a leather whip on his belt and a gun tucked into his pants, and he used both often. The enslaved people on the Hargrove Farm feared him more than they feared Hargrove himself, because Thorne's cruelty was hard to predict and felt personal. He seemed to enjoy finding reasons to punish, asserting his power over people who had no way to fight back. Thorne had come to the Hargrove Farm in the spring of 1845, recommended by another planter who liked his ability to keep order and keep work speed high. Within weeks of him getting there, the feeling on the farm had changed a lot. Where Samuel Hargrove had been distant but mostly predictable, Thorne was always there and explosive. He would show up without warning in the fields, watching the workers with cold, calculating eyes, looking for any sign of slowness or fighting back. He made new rules. No talking during work hours, no meeting in groups larger than 3, no moving between the cabins and the fields without clear permission. Breaking rules was met with fast and harsh punishment. The enslaved group numbered about 60 people, ranging from young kids to old men and women who had spent their whole lives in chains. They lived in a group of rough wooden cabins near the tobacco barns, buildings that gave little cover from the weather and no privacy at all. Each cabin held several families with thin walls that did nothing to stop sound and holes in the floor that let in cold air during the winter months. The cabins were set in 2 straight lines, making a narrow road down the middle where children played during the short times of free time, and where adults met after the workday ended to share news and comfort. Among this group were 4 people who would become the center of the events of that August night: a man named Jacob, a woman named Esther, and 2 younger men, Thomas and Samuel. Each had their own story, their own history of loss and living, and each had learned to deal with the brutal facts of farm life in their own way. Jacob was in his early 30s, though the hard years of work had made him look older. He had been born on a farm in Virginia, where his mother had worked in the main house as a cook, and his father had been a skilled metal worker. Jacob had grown up with a bit of privilege that was rare for an enslaved child. He had learned to read and write from the planters' children who had treated him as a playmate during their early years, and he had been trained by his father in the basics of metal work and building. But when Jacob was 15, the planter had died, and the property had been split among his heirs. Jacob's family was broken up and sold to different buyers. He never saw his parents again. He was bought by a man named Richard Dalton, who owned a smaller farm in the Virginia Piedmont. Dalton was a dog breeder and hunter, and he fast saw that Jacob was naturally good with animals. Jacob was put to work in the pens caring for Dalton's best hunting dogs, blue tick hounds and red bone hounds that were used for tracking deer, bear, and sometimes runaway slaves. Jacob spent 5 years working with those dogs, learning how they acted, understanding what they needed, and growing a deep respect for their smarts and loyalty. He learned that dogs responded not to violence, but to being steady, having patience, and speaking clearly. He learned to read their body moves, to see the small signs of fear or anger, and to build trust through gentle handling and regular care. But in 1842, Richard Dalton fell into debt and was forced to sell off parts of his property, including several of his enslaved workers. Jacob was sold to a trader who moved him south to Georgia, where he was bought by Samuel Hargrove. The change was crushing. Jacob had made real bonds with the dogs he had cared for, and being taken from them felt like losing family all over again. On the Hargrove farm, he was assigned to work as a carpenter, fixing buildings and making new ones as needed. It was skilled work, and Jacob was thankful for it. But he missed the dogs. He missed the quiet friendship they had given, the feeling of purpose he had felt in caring for them. Esther was older than Jacob, maybe in her mid-40s, though she had long since stopped counting the years. She had been born on the Hargrove farm, the daughter of a woman who had died giving birth and a father she had never known. Esther had spent her whole life on this land, watching generations of enslaved people come and go, seeing the cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death, hope and sadness. She had given birth to 5 children over the years, but only 2 had lived past being babies, and both had been sold away when they got to be teenagers. The pain of those losses had hardened something inside her, but it had also given her a strong will to survive, to last, to find small moments of dignity, and fighting back in a system built to strip her of both. Esther worked mostly in the fields, though she also acted as a healer and helper for births for the enslaved community. She had learned about healing plants from her mother and from other older women on the farm, and she knew how to treat common sicknesses, fevers, infections, stomach problems, and cuts. She kept a small garden behind her cabin where she grew herbs and roots. And people came to her when they were sick or hurt, trusting her knowledge more than they trusted the farm's white doctor, who rarely visited and showed little interest in their health. Esther was also a keeper of stories. She remembered the names of people who had been sold away, the details of their lives, the reasons for their leaving. She remembered the old songs and prayers that had been passed down from earlier times, and she taught them to the younger people, making sure that the memories and traditions would not be lost. In this way, she acted as a living library of the farm's history, a holder of knowledge and memory that existed outside the official papers kept by Samuel Hargrove. Thomas and Samuel were brothers, both in their early 20s, born to a woman named Ruth, who had died of a lung sickness when they were teenagers. The brothers were always together, working side by side in the fields and sharing a corner of one of the cabins. They were strong and fast, often given the hardest physical jobs, clearing new land, carrying wood, digging water ditches. They had inherited their mother's quiet strength and her stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the system that held them captive. Thomas was the older of the two by about 18 months. He was tall and broad, shouldered with hands that were rough and scarred from years of hard work. He spoke rarely, preferring to talk through looks and signs, but when he did speak, people listened. He was known for being fair and calm, and he often helped settle fights among the enslaved group. Thomas had once been whipped nearly to death by a past overseer for refusing to hit another enslaved person who had been accused of stealing food. The scars on his back were proof of his refusal to take part in the farm's system of policing itself, and they had earned him respect among his peers. Samuel, the younger brother, talked more and was more social. He was quick with a joke and had a talent for telling stories, and he often entertained the other workers during the short rest times with funny tales and thoughts. But beneath the humor was a deep anger, a burning resentment that he worked hard to keep hidden from the overseers. Samuel had seen his mother's death, had held her hand as she struggled to breathe, and he had never forgiven the farm for denying her proper medical care. He dreamed of running away, of freedom, of a life where he and his brother could make their own choices and live without fear. The summer of 1847 had been very hard. The heat was non-stop, with temperatures climbing very high day after day, and the muggy air made it feel thick and heavy. The tobacco crop needed constant care. The plants had to be trimmed and checked for bugs, and the work hurt their backs. Thorn drove the workers harder than usual, keeping the work days going into the evening and cutting food amounts as punishment for what he thought was laziness. He seemed to take special joy in finding mistakes, in picking out people for public shame and punishment. Bad feelings bubbled beneath the surface, unspoken, but easy to feel. The enslaved community had learned to talk in subtle ways, through looks and signs, through songs with secret meanings, through carefully chosen words that could mean many things. It was during this time that whispers of running away began to spread, not loud or careless whispers, but quiet, careful talks held in the shadows of the cabins after the overseers had gone to bed for the night. The idea of escape was not new. It was a constant thought in the lives of enslaved people, a dream that kept them going through the worst moments, and a chance that was always there, however small. But planning a real escape was extremely dangerous. The farm was isolated, surrounded by miles of thick forest and wet swamp land. The nearest free state was hundreds of miles to the north, and the trip would require traveling through enemy land, avoiding slave patrols, and finding food and shelter along the way. The risks were huge, and the cost of failing was high. Public whipping, burning marks on skin, sail to the deep south, or even death. But for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, the dream of freedom had become more than just a far-off hope. It had become a need, a goal worth risking everything to get. They began to meet in secret. Late at night, when the rest of the farm was asleep, gathering in a small opening in the woods past the cabins, they spoke in low voices, planning paths, talking about plans, and sharing facts they had gathered from traders and travelers who passed through the area. Jacob gave his knowledge of the land around them. During his years on the Dalton farm in Virginia, he had gone with hunting parties into the wild, and he had learned to read the land, to find his way by the stars, and to find water and shelter in the forest. He knew that the key to a good escape was getting ready and having patience. They would need to gather supplies, choose the right moment, and move fast once they committed to the plan. Esther brought her knowledge of healing plants and her understanding of the timing of farm life. She knew when the overseers were most likely to be busy elsewhere, when the patrols were scheduled, and which paths through the woods were least likely to be watched. She also served as a voice of caution, reminding the others of the dangers and urging them to think carefully about every detail. Thomas and Samuel provided the body strength and will that would be needed for the trip. They were young and tough, able to handle long periods of physical work, and they were willing to take risks that older or more careful people might avoid. Samuel, especially, was eager to move forward, to take action rather than simply talking about chances. But Garrett Thorne was not a man easily tricked. He had spent years learning to read the small changes in behavior that showed unhappiness or rebellion. He noticed when talking stopped fast as he came near. He saw the way certain people avoided looking at him or moved with a new hurry. And he had snitches, people who, out of fear or need, would trade information for small favors or the promise of easier treatment. One of these snitches was a man named Peter, a middle-aged field hand who had been on the farm for over 20 years. Peter had once been a strong and proud man, but years of brutal treatment had broken something inside him. He had learned that staying alive sometimes required making deals, doing things that went against his own moral code. When Thorne approached him one evening and asked if he had heard any talk of escape plans, Peter paused for only a moment before telling him what he knew. Peter did not give names at first. He spoke in vague terms about rumors and whispers, hoping that would be enough to satisfy Thorne without directly blaming anyone. But Thorne pressed him, threatening to cut his food and increase his work if he did not give more specific information. Faced with the idea of even greater suffering, Peter gave in. He told Thorne about the late-night meetings in the woods, about the 4 people who seemed to be at the center of the planning, about the conversations he had overheard regarding paths and supplies. Thorne listened carefully, his face showing nothing. When Peter finished speaking, Thorn nodded slowly and told him to return to his cabin and say nothing to anyone. Peter left, his shoulders hunched with shame and fear, knowing that he had betrayed his own people, but unable to see any other way forward. Thorn spent the next several days watching Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, tracking their movements and talks. He saw the way they glanced at each other across the fields, the way they seemed to speak without words. He noticed that they often finished their assigned tasks quickly, and then waited near the edge of the woods, as if waiting for something. He became sure that they were indeed planning an escape, and he decided to act before they could put their plan into action. On the evening of August 14th, as the sun went down below the tree line and the air cooled slightly, Thorn made his move. He gathered a group of trusted men, 2 other overseers named Dalton and Harris, and 3 hired hands who worked on the farm as general workers. He armed them with clubs and ropes and led them to the cabins just as the enslaved community was settling in for the night. The raid was fast and brutal. Thorn and his men burst into the cabins, shouting orders and dragging people out into the narrow lane. They searched for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, pulling them from their sleeping spots and tying their hands with rough rope. The other enslaved people watched in silence, their faces lit by the shaking light of torches as the 4 accused were lined up in the center of the lane. Thorn stood before them, his face twisted with anger and happiness. He accused them of planning to escape, of plotting against the farm, of betraying the trust that Samuel Hargrove had placed in them. He did not offer them a chance to defend themselves or to explain. He had already decided their fate. The kennels were located on the far edge of the farm, near the tree line where the planted land gave way to wild woods. They were rough buildings, little more than wooden pens with chain fences designed to house the hunting dogs that Hargrove used for tracking game and sometimes runaway slaves. The kennels had been built several years earlier when Hargrove had decided to invest in a pack of dogs for hunting and security purposes. The structures were useful but poorly kept, with rusted hinges and holes in the fencing that had been fixed with wire and scrap wood. There were 6 dogs in total, large, strong animals with short coats and powerful jaws. They were a mix of breeds, mostly bloodhounds and curs, chosen for their tracking skill and their meanness. The dogs were kept in a state of constant hunger and stress, fed at random times and beaten when they failed to perform as expected. They lived in dirty conditions, their pens rarely cleaned, and they had learned to connect humans with pain and lack of food. They were not pets or friends. They were tools, weapons to be used when needed and ignored the rest of the time. Thorn ordered the 4 accused to be taken to the kennels. The other enslaved people watched in horror as Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel were marched across the property, their hands still tied, their faces set in looks of grim determination. The night was thick with humidity, and the sound of cicadas filled the air, a constant buzzing that seemed to make the tension louder. As they walked, Esther began to hum softly, a tune that the others recognized as an old spiritual song, a song of hope and lasting. Thomas and Samuel joined in, their voices low but steady, and even Jacob, who rarely sang, added his voice to the group. When they reached the kennels, Thorn gave the order. The gates were opened and the 4 were shoved inside, their ropes cut so that their hands were free, but their choices were limited. The dogs, which had been lying in the shadows at the back of the pen, immediately rose to their feet, their ears pricked forward, their bodies tight. The gate was slammed shut and locked, and Thorn and his men stepped back, forming a half-circle around the kennel to watch what would happen next. What happened next went against all logic and expectation. The dogs did not attack. Instead, they circled the four people slowly, sniffing the air and the ground, their ears flat against their heads. Jacob stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the nearest dog. A massive striped hound with scars across its nose and a notch missing from one ear. The dog approached carefully, its nose twitching as it caught Jacob's scent. Jacob did not move. He did not raise his hands or make any fast gestures. He simply stood there, breathing slowly and evenly, allowing the dog to check him on its own terms. Esther pressed her back against the fence, her breath coming in short gasps. She had never been this close to the dogs before, and the sight of their strong bodies and sharp teeth filled her with terror. But she forced herself to remain still, remembering Jacob's quiet instructions during their planning meetings. He had told them that if they ever found themselves in danger from animals, the key was to avoid triggering their hunting instincts. No running, no screaming, no sudden movements, just stillness and calm. Thomas and Samuel stood shoulder to shoulder, their fists clenched despite the absence of ropes. They watched the dogs with a mix of fear and defiance, ready to fight if necessary, but hoping it would not come to that. Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, a fast drum beat that seemed to drown out all other sounds. Thomas placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, a silent sign of unity and support. The striped hound finished sniffing Jacob and took a step back, its tail lowering slightly. It tilted its head to one side as if trying to understand what it was seeing. Jacob slowly put out one hand, palm down, allowing the dog to sniff it. The dog approached again, more carefully this time, and touched its nose to Jacob's hand. Jacob remained still, his breathing steady, his face calm. After a moment, the dog's tail gave a small wag, barely seen but unmistakable. Another dog, a lean black animal with a white patch on its chest, approached Esther. She fought the urge to shrink away, forcing herself to stand still as the dog sniffed her legs and then her hands. The dog's breath was hot and smelly, and Esther could see the ribs sticking out beneath its thin coat. She felt a sudden rush of pity for the animal, recognizing in it the same suffering and lack of needs that she and her people endured every day. Without thinking, she whispered softly, "It's all right. I won't hurt you." The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. It looked up at her face, its dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment there was a connection, a knowing of shared suffering, of mutual weakness. The dog's tail wagged once, twice, and then it lowered itself to the ground at Esther's feet, resting its head on its paws. The remaining dogs approached Thomas and Samuel, circling them carefully. One of the dogs, a reddish, brown hound with a scarred side, growled low in its throat, and Samuel tensed, preparing for an attack. But Thomas spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "Easy now. We're not here to hurt you. Easy." The growling stopped. The dog took a step closer, sniffing Samuel's leg, and then moved on to Thomas. It circled them both, its movement slow and intentional, and then it too lowered itself to the ground. The other dogs followed suit one by one until all 6 animals were lying down, forming a loose circle around the 4 people, but making no move to harm them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the cicadas in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft breathing of the dogs. Jacob slowly lowered himself to a sitting position, his back against the fence, his movements careful and slow. The striped hound watched him but did not react. Esther followed his lead, sinking down to the ground with the black dog still resting at her feet. Thomas and Samuel remained standing for a few more minutes, their eyes scanning the kennel, and then they too sat down, their backs against the opposite fence. Outside the kennel, Garrett Thorne stood frozen, his face twisted in confusion and anger. He had expected screams, blood, the sounds of tearing meat and breaking bones. He had expected the dogs to do what they had been trained to do, to attack without waiting, to remove the threat, to serve as tools of his will. But the dogs had refused. They had not only refused to attack, they had actively chosen to lie down, to submit, to reject the role that had been assigned to them. Thorne shouted orders at the dogs, telling them to attack. But the animals did not respond. They remained where they were, their eyes half closed, their bodies relaxed. Thorne picked up a stick and rattled it against the fence, trying to provoke them, but they did not move. He fired his pistol into the air, the sharp crack echoing across the farm, but the dogs merely flinched and then settled back down. The other men with Thorne exchanged uneasy looks. Dalton, one of the overseers, mumbled something about the dogs being sick or drugged. Harris suggested that maybe the four people had some kind of charm or spell that was protecting them. The hired hands said nothing, but their faces showed their discomfort. This was not how things were supposed to go. The natural order had been messed up and no one knew what to do about it. Thorne's frustration grew with each passing minute. He paced back and forth in front of the kennel, his hands clenching and unclenching, his mind racing. He considered shooting the four people himself, but something held him back. Perhaps the presence of witnesses, or perhaps a flicker of superstition that even he could not entirely push down. The scene was too strange, too impossible to explain. It felt wrong in a way that went beyond simple disobedience. It felt like a challenge to the basic assumptions that ruled his world, a suggestion that the power he held was not as absolute as he had believed. As the night wore on, the dogs remained calm. They did not growl or show their teeth. They did not pace or show signs of being upset. Instead, they seemed almost protective, placing themselves between the four people and the fence, as if guarding them from the men outside. At one point, the striped hound rose to its feet and walked over to Jacob, sniffing his face and then licking his hand. Jacob reached out slowly and scratched the dog behind the ears, and the animal leaned into the touch, its eyes closing in what looked like happiness. Esther watched this interaction with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. She had never seen a dog behave this way, had never imagined that such a connection was possible between human and animal. In a place like this, she thought about the stories her mother had told her. Stories about a time before slavery, when people and animals had lived in peace, when the natural world had been a source of life and friendship rather than danger and use. She wondered if what she was seeing was a glimpse of that lost world, a reminder that even in the darkest places there was the possibility of kindness and connection. By midnight, Thorne had had enough. He ordered the gates to be locked and the torches put out. He told the other men to return to their quarters and to speak of this to no one. He himself retreated to the overseer's house, a small structure near the main house where he lived alone. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk, staring out the window toward the kennels, trying to make sense of what he had seen. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and drank it quickly, then poured another. His mind churned with questions and doubts, with anger and confusion. He had built his entire identity on his ability to control, to dominate, to force his will through fear and violence. But tonight, that power had been challenged in a way he could not understand or accept. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, shifting from deep black to dark blue to pale gray. The cicadas fell silent, replaced by the chirping of early morning birds. The farm began to stir with people emerging from the cabins to begin another day of work. Thorn rose from his desk, his eyes red and his face tired, and walked back to the kennels. The dogs were still there, still calm, still positioned around the four people. Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel were exhausted but unharmed. They had spent the night sitting or lying on the ground, dozing fitfully, always aware of the dog's presence, but no longer afraid. When Thorn appeared at the gate, the dogs rose to their feet, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Thorn thought they might attack him, and he took an involuntary step backward, but the dogs did not move toward him. They simply stood there, forming a wall between him and the four people. Thorn unlocked the gate and ordered Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel to come out. They rose slowly, their muscles stiff from the long night, and walked toward the gate. The dogs watched them go, but did not follow. As the four people stepped out of the kennel, the striped hound let out a low whine, a sound that was almost sad. Jacob paused and looked back at the dog, and for a moment their eyes met. Then Jacob turned away and followed the others back toward the cabins. Thorn locked the gate behind them and stood there for a long moment staring at the dogs. They had returned to their resting positions, lying on the ground with their heads on their paws, but their eyes remained open, watching him. Thorn felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling he had not felt in years. He turned and walked away, his mind still churning with unanswered questions. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the story of the Hargrove farm gets deeper. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Over the following days, strange things began to happen on the Hargrove farm. The dogs, once fierce and obedient, became hard to predict. They refused to respond to Thorn's commands. They would not hunt, they would not track. When Thorn tried to force them into the woods for a training drill, they simply sat down and refused to move. It was as if something had broken inside them, some basic part of their training that could not be fixed. Thorn grew increasingly paranoid. He began to suspect that Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel had somehow used magic on the animals, though he could not explain how or why. He questioned them repeatedly, demanding to know what they had done. But they gave him no answers. They simply stared at him with expressions that were neither defiant nor submissive, just blank, unreadable. Jacob in particular seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if Thorn were not even worth seeing. The other enslaved people on the farm began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of the night in the kennels as if it were a miracle, a sign that even the cruelest tools of oppression could be turned against their masters. The story spread quickly, passed from person to person in hushed tones during the brief moments when they were out of earshot of the overseers. Some saw it as proof of God helping, a show that God had not left them despite their suffering. Others saw it as proof that the natural world itself could rebel against injustice. that animals had a moral sense that humans sometimes lacked. Peter, the man who had informed on Jacob and the others, was eaten up by guilt. He could not sleep, could not eat, could not look his fellow workers in the eye. He had expected the 4 to be killed, had believed that his betrayal would result in their deaths, and that he would have to carry that burden for the rest of his life. But they had survived, and their survival felt like an accusation, a constant reminder of his weakness and cowardice. He began to avoid them, taking long ways through the farm to ensure he would not cross their paths. But he could not escape the weight of what he had done. One evening, about a week after the event in the kennels, Peter approached Esther as she was tending her garden. He stood at the edge of the small plot, his hands twisting nervously, his eyes fixed on the ground. Esther looked up from her work, her face showing nothing, and waited for him to speak. "I'm sorry," Peter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for what I done. I was scared, Thorn. He threatened me, and I didn't know what else to do." Esther studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she returned her attention to the plants, pulling weeds and adjusting the soil around the roots. "You made your choice," she said quietly. "We all make choices. Some we can live with, some we can't." Peter nodded, his shoulders sagging. He wanted to say more, to explain, to justify, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. He turned and walked away, leaving Esther to her work. Meanwhile, Thorn's obsession with restoring order grew. He tried everything he could think of to regain control of the dogs. He starved them, hoping that hunger would wake up their aggression. He beat them, hoping that pain would force them back into submission. He brought in a trainer from a nearby farm, a man who claimed to have experience with difficult animals, but even he could not make the dogs respond. They remained calm, almost lazy, as if they had lost all interest in the world around them. The trainer, a rough man named Horace, spent 3 days working with the dogs before giving up. He told Thorn that the animals had been broken in some basic way, that whatever had happened in the kennels that night had damaged them beyond repair. "It's like they've lost their spirit," Horace said, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it. You might as well put them down and start over with a new pack." Thorn thought about this advice, but he did not want to follow it. The dogs represented a big investment, and he did not want to admit defeat. He also could not shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something he did not understand. He began to spend hours watching the dogs, studying their behavior, trying to find some clue that would explain what had happened. One afternoon, as Thorn stood outside the kennels, Jacob walked past on his way to the carpentry shop. Thorn called out to him, ordering him to stop. Jacob paused and turned to face him, his face calm and patient. "What did you do to them?" Thorn demanded, pointing toward the dogs. "What did you do that night?" Jacob looked at the dogs, then back at Thorn. "I didn't do anything," he said simply. "I just didn't give them a reason to hurt me." "That's not an answer," Thorn snapped. "Those dogs are trained killers. They should have torn you apart, but they didn't. Why?" Jacob was silent for a moment, considering his response. Then he said, "Maybe they're tired of being killers. Maybe they wanted something different." Thorn stared at him, his jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. He wanted to strike Jacob to force him to give a better answer, but something held him back. There was a quiet dignity in Jacob's manner, a sense of self-control that Thorn found deeply unsettling. He waved Jacob away dismissively and turned back to the kennels, his mind still churning with frustration and confusion. As the days passed, the feeling on the farm grew increasingly tense. The enslaved community sensed that something had shifted, that the balance of power had been messed up in some small but big way. They did not speak openly about it, but they felt it. A new sense of possibility, a flicker of hope that had not been there before. They worked as they always had, following orders and avoiding punishment. But there was a new energy beneath the surface, a quiet will that had not existed before the night in the kennels. Thorn, meanwhile, became more erratic and unpredictable. He lashed out at workers for minor mistakes, giving harsh punishments for perceived slights. He increased the work, extending the hours in the fields and cutting food even further. He seemed determined to prove his authority, to prove that he was still in control, but his efforts only served to deepen the anger and fear that filled the farm. 2 weeks after the event in the kennels, Samuel Hargrove returned from Savannah. He had been away for nearly a month, attending to business matters and socializing with other planters. When he arrived back at the farm, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The atmosphere was different, more tense, more charged. He called Thorn to the main house and demanded an explanation. Thorn tried to downplay the situation, describing the event in the kennels as a small disruption that he had handled appropriately. But Hargrove was not satisfied. He had heard rumors during his time in Savannah, whispers about strange happenings on his farm, about dogs that refused to attack, about enslaved people who had somehow survived an ordeal that should have killed them. The stories had reached the ears of other planters, and they had begun to question Hargrove's ability to keep order on his own property. Hargrove was furious. He confronted Thorn in his study, his voice cold and controlled. "You have made me look like a fool," he said. "You have allowed a situation to develop that has become the subject of gossip and talk throughout the county. This is unacceptable." Thorn tried to defend himself, insisting that he had done what was necessary to keep discipline, but Hargrove cut him off. "You have failed," he said flatly. "The dogs are useless, the workers are restless, and my name has been damaged. I cannot afford to keep you on as overseer." Thorn's face went pale. "You're firing me. I am removing you from your duties," Hargrove said. "You will leave the farm by the end of the week. I will provide you with a letter of reference, but I suggest you look for work elsewhere, preferably in another county." Thorn left the study in a daze, his mind reeling. He had built his entire identity around his job as overseer, around his ability to control and dominate. To be dismissed was not just a job setback. It was a personal shame, a denial of everything he believed about himself. He returned to his quarters and began packing his things, his movements mechanical, his thoughts dark and bitter. On his last day at the farm, Thorn took one final walk around the property. He stopped at the kennels and looked at the dogs, which were lying in the shade, their eyes half closed. They did not notice his presence. He thought about shooting them, about destroying the proof of his failure, but he did not have the energy or the will. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the dogs behind. As Thorn rode away from the Hargrove farm, heading south toward the coast, he carried with him a sense of unfinished business, a gnawing feeling that he had been defeated by forces he could not understand or control. He would never return to the county, and he would never speak of what had happened in the kennels that August night, but the memory would haunt him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that power was not as absolute as he had believed, that there were limits to what could be forced, lines that could not be crossed no matter how much authority one held. As for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, their fate was more confusing and more sad. Samuel Hargrove did not punish them further for the escape attempt. He realized that doing so would only draw more attention to the incident and fuel more gossip, but he also could not allow them to remain together, to continue to represent a challenge to his authority. He made the decision to separate them, to scatter them across the farm, and eventually to sell some of them away. Within a month of Thorne's departure, Thomas and Samuel were sold to a trader named William Gaines, who was gathering a group of enslaved people to be moved west toward Alabama and Mississippi. The sale was conducted quickly and quietly with little paperwork. Thomas and Samuel were given no warning, no chance to say goodbye to the people they had lived and worked with for years. They were simply taken from the fields one afternoon, their hands tied, and marched to a holding pen near the main road where Gaines was gathering his human cargo. The night before they were to leave, Esther managed to slip away from her work and make her way to the holding pen. She brought with her a small bundle of food, cornbread, and dried meat, and a bag of herbs that she pressed into Thomas's hands. "For fevers and infections," she whispered, "keep it hidden. It might save your life someday." Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He and Samuel had known this day would come, had understood that their survival in the kennels had only delayed what was going to happen, but the reality of it was still devastating. "Take care of yourself," Thomas said to Esther, "and tell Jacob. Tell him we're grateful for everything." Esther nodded, unable to speak. She reached through the bars of the pen and squeezed Samuel's hand, then turned and walked away before the guards could see her. She did not look back. The next morning, Thomas and Samuel were chained together and added to the line of nearly 30 enslaved people who would be marched hundreds of miles to the west. The journey would take weeks, and many would not survive it. Thomas and Samuel walked side by side, their faces set in expressions of grim determination, their minds focused on the simple goal of staying alive. They carried with them the memory of the night in the kennels, the memory of the dogs that had refused to kill them. And they drew strength from that memory, even as they faced an uncertain and terrifying future. The trail of Thomas and Samuel went cold after they reached Alabama. There were no further records of their sale, no papers of their lives or deaths. It was as if they had simply vanished into the vast and brutal machine of the slave trade. 2 more lives swallowed up by a system that treated human beings as goods to be bought, sold, and thrown away. Esther remained on the Hargrove farm, but her life became increasingly difficult. Samuel Hargrove, still hurting from the embarrassment of the kennel incident, decided to reassign her from field work to house service in the main house. On the surface, this might have seemed like an improvement. House workers were generally better fed and housed than field hands, but in reality it was a form of punishment. Esther was now under constant watch, her every movement watched and checked. She was separated from the community she had served as healer and storyteller, isolated in the main house where she had to handle the complex and often hostile dynamics of the household staff. The work was exhausting in a different way than field labor. Esther was expected to be available at all hours to guess the needs of the Hargrove family before they were even expressed, to endure insults and abuse without complaint. She was assigned to work under the head housekeeper, a free black woman named Margaret, who had adopted the farm's hierarchies and who treated the enslaved house workers with dislike and cruelty. Margaret saw Esther as a threat, a woman with knowledge and authority within the enslaved community, and she made it her mission to break Esther's spirit. But Esther endured. She had survived too much, had witnessed too many losses to be broken. Now she performed her duties with quiet speed, keeping her thoughts and feelings hidden behind a mask of obedience. At night, when she was finally allowed to rest, she would lie on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and think about the night in the kennels, about the dogs that had refused to attack, about the strange and unexplainable mercy that had been shown to her and her friends. She thought about Thomas and Samuel, wondering if they were still alive, if they were still together, if they remembered that night as clearly as she did. Esther's health began to fail in the years following the kennel incident. The stress of her new position, combined with the piled-up toll of decades of hard labor and bad nutrition, weakened her body. She developed a bad cough that would not go away, and she began to lose weight. Margaret showed no pity, insisting that Esther continue to work even when she was clearly ill. Samuel Hargrove, when told of Esther's condition, simply shrugged and said that she could be replaced if necessary. In the winter of 1851, Esther's condition got much worse. The cough became more severe, joined by fever and chest pain. She was finally allowed to rest, but by then it was too late. She died on a cold January morning, alone in the servants' quarters, her body worn out by a lifetime of suffering and use. She was buried in the slave cemetery on the edge of the property, her grave marked only by a wooden cross that bore no name, no dates, no mention of the life she had lived or the people she had helped. Jacob remained on the Hargrove farm longer than any of the others. He continued to work in the carpentry shop, fixing buildings and making new structures as needed. He was a valuable asset to the farm, and Samuel Hargrove was reluctant to sell him. But Jacob was never the same after the night in the kennels. He spoke less, worked mechanically, and seemed to carry a weight that no one else could see. He had lost his friends, the people who had shared his dream of freedom, and the loss had hollowed him out in some basic way. Jacob thought often about the dogs, about the strange connection he had felt with them that night. He had spent years working with dogs on the Dalton farm in Virginia, and he had always believed that animals were capable of kindness and loyalty, that they could form real bonds with humans. But what had happened in the kennels had been different. It had not been about training or habits. It had been about recognition, about a shared understanding of suffering and weakness. The dogs had seen in Jacob and his friends something that went beyond the roles they had been assigned, and they had chosen to respond with mercy rather than violence. In the years following the incident, Jacob began to develop a quiet philosophy, a way of understanding the world that helped him make sense of his experiences. He came to believe that there were limits to what could be forced, that even the most brutal systems of control could not completely erase the capacity for kindness and connection. He believed that the dogs had taught him something important, that resistance did not always have to be loud or violent, that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance was simply refusing to participate in cruelty, choosing mercy over violence even when violence was expected. Jacob shared these thoughts with a few trusted people on the farm, speaking in quiet conversations during the brief moments of rest. He did not preach or push. He simply offered his view, his understanding, and he left it to others to decide what to make of it. Some dismissed his ideas as silly or impossible, but others found comfort and inspiration in them. They began to see the night in the kennels not as a single incident, but as a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there was the possibility of unexpected grace. The Civil War came to Georgia in 1864, bringing with it chaos and destruction. Union forces swept through the state, burning farms and freeing enslaved people. The Hargrove farm was not spared. The main house was set on fire during Sherman's march to the sea, and the fields were left to grow over with weeds. Samuel Hargrove fled to Savannah, taking with him whatever valuables he could carry, and he never returned. Jacob was in his early 50s by then, his body worn down by decades of hard labor. When the Union soldiers arrived and announced that slavery had been ended, Jacob felt a strange mix of feelings: relief, disbelief, and a deep sadness for all the years that had been stolen from him. He left the farm on foot, carrying nothing but a small bundle of things, and walked north toward the mountains. The journey was difficult. Jacob was not as strong as he had once been, and the roads were crowded with other freedmen and refugees, all searching for safety and opportunity. He traveled slowly, stopping often to rest, and he relied on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. Along the way, he met other people who had been enslaved, and he shared his story with them. The story of the night in the kennels, the story of the dogs that had refused to kill. Some had heard versions of the story before, passed down through the years, and they listened with close attention as Jacob filled in the details they had never known. Jacob eventually settled in a small community in the mountains of northern Georgia, a place where freedmen had begun to build new lives for themselves. He found work as a carpenter, using the skills he had developed over the years to build homes and furniture for his neighbors. He lived in a small cabin near a creek, a simple building that he had built with his own hands, and he kept to himself for the most part, happy with the quiet peace of his new life. But Jacob did not forget the dogs. He carved a small wooden figure, a rough image of the striped hound that had been the first to approach him in the kennels, and he kept it on a shelf in his cabin. When visitors asked about it, he would smile and say, "They were good dogs, better than most people." He never explained more, never told the full story unless someone pressed him. But the carving was a constant reminder of that night, a symbol of the unexpected mercy that had saved his life. Jacob lived for another 7 years after the end of the war. He died in 1872 at the age of 60, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of hard labor and want. He was buried in a small cemetery near his cabin, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross. The people in the community remembered him as a quiet, thoughtful man who had lived through great suffering, but who had never lost his capacity for kindness and hope. The dogs, meanwhile, were eventually put down. Samuel Hargrove, before he fled the farm, had given orders for the animals to be destroyed. They had become useless, unable to perform the tasks they had been trained for, and Hargrove could not afford to keep them. The dogs were shot one by one and buried in a shallow grave near the tree line, their bodies covered with dirt and left to rot. The kennels were taken apart, the wood saved for other projects, and the site was left to grow over with weeds and wild grass. But the story of the dogs did not die with them. It lived on in the memories of the people who had witnessed the events of that August night, and it was passed down through generations, told and retold in different forms. The story spread beyond the Hargrove farm, carried by traders and travelers who passed through the area, and it became part of the folklore of northern Georgia. In the decades following the Civil War, as the formerly enslaved people began to build new lives and communities, the story of the kennels took on new meanings. For some, It was a story about the power of kindness and the limits of cruelty. For others, it was a story about resistance and survival, about the ways that people and animals could refuse to take part in systems of oppression. And for still others, it was simply a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was the possibility of unexpected grace, of connections that went beyond the brutal levels of slavery. The story was told in churches and community meetings, in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren, in letters and books written by people who had lived through the era of slavery. Each telling added new details or highlighted different aspects, but the core remained the same. 4 people had been thrown to the dogs, and the dogs had refused to kill them. In the 1890s, a historian named Margaret Calloway began researching the history of slavery in northern Georgia. She was interested in stories of resistance and survival, and she had heard rumors of the incident at the Hargrove farm. She traveled to the area and spent months interviewing old residents, many of whom had been enslaved during the time before the war. She looked through county records, farm ledgers, and personal letters, piecing together fragments of information. What she discovered was both illuminating and heartbreaking. According to several stories, Jacob had been a dog handler on a previous farm in Virginia. He had worked with hunting dogs for years, training them, caring for them, and learning their behaviors. When he was sold to the Hargrove farm, he had brought that knowledge with him. He knew how to read a dog's body language, how to calm an upset animal, and how to build trust, even in the most hostile circumstances. On the night he was thrown into the kennels, Jacob had not panicked. Instead, he had used every skill he had learned over the years. He had stood still, avoiding sudden movements that might trigger an attack. He had spoken softly, using a low, steady voice that the dogs would recognize as safe. He had allowed them to approach him on their own terms, to sniff him and check him without feeling pressured. And slowly, carefully, he had won them over. Esther, Thomas, and Samuel had followed his lead. They had trusted him even in the face of almost certain death, and they had remained calm. The dogs, sensing no aggression or fear, had responded in kind. They had not attacked because there was nothing to attack, only 4 people who posed no threat, who smelled of sweat and exhaustion and desperation, but not of violence. It was not a miracle. It was not magic. It was simply the result of one man's knowledge and the willingness of 3 others to trust him in the darkest moment of their lives. But there was more to the story. Calloway also uncovered evidence that the dogs on the Hargrove farm had been mistreated for years. They had been starved, beaten, and forced to live in terrible conditions. They had been trained to kill, but they had also been trained to connect humans with pain and suffering. When they met Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, people who did not hurt them, who did not shout at them or hit them, they responded with something that looked like relief. For the first time in their lives, they were in the presence of humans who did not want to harm them. In a way, the dogs had chosen kindness over cruelty. They had refused to keep going with the cycle of violence that had defined their existence, and in doing so, they had saved 4 lives and inspired countless others. Calloway's research did not end with the discovery of Jacob's skills as a dog handler. She continued to dig deeper, searching for any trace of what had happened to the 4 people after they were separated. She found records of Thomas and Samuel being sold to a farm in Alabama, but the trail went cold after that. There were no further sales, no death certificates, no mention of them in any surviving documents. It was as if they had simply disappeared. Esther's fate was slightly clearer. Calloway found a note in the Hargrove farm ledger indicating that she had died in 1851, 4 years after the incident in the kennels. The cause of death was listed as fever, a vague term that could have meant anything from malaria to typhoid to simple exhaustion. She was buried in the slave cemetery on the edge of the property, her grave marked only by a wooden cross that had long since rotted away. Jacob's story was the most difficult to trace. He remained on the Hargrove farm until 1865, when the Civil War ended and slavery was ended. He was in his early 50s by then, his body worn down by decades of hard labor. According to one account, he left the farm on foot, carrying nothing but a small bundle of things, and walked north toward the mountains. No one knew where he went or what became of him. Some believed he had died on the road, too weak to complete the journey. Others thought he might have found a community of freedmen and lived out his remaining years in relative peace. But Calloway found one final piece of evidence that suggested a different ending. In a collection of letters donated to a history group in Atlanta, she discovered a letter written in 1872 by a school teacher in the mountains of northern Georgia. The teacher described meeting an elderly black man who had settled in a small cabin near a creek. The man was quiet and kept to himself, but he was known in the area for his skill with animals. He could calm a scared horse with a few words, train a dog to obey without ever raising his voice, and get wild birds to eat from his hand. The teacher did not mention the man's name, but she noted that he had scars on his wrists, old scars, she said, that looked like they had been made by ropes. She also mentioned that he kept a small wooden carving on a shelf in his cabin, a rough figure of a dog that he had whittled himself. When she asked him about it, he simply smiled and said they were good dogs, better than most people. Calloway believed that the man in the letter was Jacob. She could not prove it beyond a doubt, but the details matched too closely to be a coincidence. If she was right, then Jacob had survived. He had lived long enough to see the end of slavery, to walk away from the farm that had held him captive for so many years, and to build a life, however small and solitary, on his own terms. The Hargrove farm itself did not survive the Civil War. Samuel Hargrove died in 1863, and his heirs sold the property to pay off debts. The main house was burned during Sherman's march to the sea, and the land was eventually divided and sold to smaller farmers. By the turn of the century, there was little left to indicate that the farm had ever existed. The fields grew over with weeds, the slave quarters fell into piles of rotting wood, and the forest took back the land. But the story of the kennels lived on. It was passed down through generations, told and retold in different forms. Some versions were dressed up with ghost elements, ghostly dogs that still roamed the woods, or a curse that had been placed on Garrett Thorne. Other versions stripped away the details, reducing the story to a simple moral lesson about the power of kindness and the limits of cruelty. In the 1920s, a writer named Harold Finch traveled to the area to investigate the legend. He interviewed several elderly residents who claimed to have heard the story from their grandparents. One woman, a former slave named Clara, told him that her grandmother had been on the Hargrove farm the night of the incident. She remembered her grandmother describing the scene in vivid detail: the torches, the shouting, the dogs lying down instead of attacking. Clara said her grandmother had always believed that the dogs had understood something that the humans did not, that the 4 people in the kennels were not their enemies. Finch also visited the site of the old farm. He found the remains of the main house, now little more than a blackened foundation overgrown with ivy. He walked through the fields, searching for any trace of the kennels, but found nothing. The forest had swallowed everything. He stood at the edge of the tree line, listening to the wind rustling through the pines, and tried to imagine what it must have been like on that August night in 1847. He wrote an article about his findings, but it was never published. The editor of the newspaper he worked for deemed the story too controversial, too difficult to verify. Finch's notes and drafts were eventually donated to a university archive where they sat unread for decades. In the 1970s, a graduate student named David Lawson found Finch's notes while researching a paper on slave resistance in the South before the war. He was interested in the story and decided to investigate further. He tracked down Margaret Calloway's research, which had been preserved in a small historical society in Georgia, and he conducted his own interviews with descendants of people who had been enslaved on the Hargrove farm. What Lawson discovered was that the story of the kennels had become a symbol of resistance and survival within the black community in northern Georgia. It was not just a tale of 4 people who had been spared by dogs. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was the possibility of unexpected mercy, of connections that went beyond the brutal levels of slavery. Lawson also found evidence that the story had influenced other enslaved people in the region. In the years following the incident, there were several reports of slaves using similar tactics to avoid punishment or escape capture. They would remain calm in the presence of dogs, speaking softly and avoiding sudden movements. And in some cases, the dogs would refuse to attack. It was as if Jacob's knowledge had spread, passed from person to person in whispered conversations, becoming a small but significant tool of survival. Lawson's paper was published in 1978, and it brought renewed attention to the story. Historians began to re-examine the incident, looking for new sources and perspectives. Some argued that the story had been exaggerated over time, that the dogs had simply been too tired or too poorly trained to attack. Others insisted that the story was essentially true, that it represented a genuine moment of kindness in a system defined by cruelty. But the debate missed the point. Whether the dogs had been influenced by Jacob's skills, by their own mistreatment, or by some combination of factors, the fact remained that they had refused to kill. They had chosen not to participate in the violence that was expected of them, and in doing so they had saved 4 lives and inspired countless others. Today, the site of the Hargrove farm is a quiet stretch of forest and farmland. There are no markers, no plaques, no signs to indicate what happened there. The kennels are long gone. The main house is a memory, and the people who lived and died on that land have been forgotten by most of the world. But the story endures. It is told in classrooms and community centers, in books and movies, in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. It is a story about the limits of power, about the unexpected ways that kindness can show up, and about the strength of people who refuse to be broken by the system that sought to destroy them. And it is a story that asks a question that still matters today. In a world built on cruelty and oppression, what does it mean when even the tools of that cruelty refuse to obey? The answer perhaps is that there are limits to what can be forced, lines that cannot be crossed, no matter how much power one holds. The dogs in the kennels that night recognized something in Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, something that went beyond the roles they had been assigned, the labels they had been given. They saw people, not property, and they chose to act accordingly. It is a small moment in the vast and brutal history of slavery in America, but it is a moment worth remembering because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is the possibility of unexpected grace, of connections that defy the logic of oppression, of choices that affirm our shared humanity. The legacy of that night in August 1847 extends far beyond the 4 individuals who survived it. It lives on in the stories that were passed down, in the tactics that were shared, in the hope that was kindled in the hearts of people who had every reason to despair. It lives on in the memory of dogs that chose kindness over violence, that refused to be tools of cruelty even when they had been trained for that purpose. And it lives on in the questions it raises about power and resistance, about the nature of cruelty and the possibility of mercy, about the ways that even the most oppressive systems contain within them the seeds of their own undoing. Because when the dogs refused to attack, they showed something basic, that obedience is not absolute, that training can be overcome, that there are limits to what can be forced even in the most brutal circumstances. This is the true horror and the true hope of the story, not the violence that was expected, but the mercy that was given, not the cruelty that was commanded, but the kindness that was chosen. It is a reminder that in every system of oppression, there are moments when the machine breaks down, when the tools refuse to work as designed, when unexpected connections are formed that go beyond the logic of domination. The story of the Hargrove Farm Kennels is not just a historical curiosity or a piece of folklore. It is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and to the capacity for kindness that exists even in the most unlikely places. It is a reminder that history is not just a record of cruelty and suffering, but also of moments when grace broke through the darkness, when mercy won over violence, when the expected order of things was disrupted by acts of unexpected kindness. This mystery shows us that history is not just a record of cruelty and suffering, but also of moments when kindness broke through the darkness. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything